I had this conversation with my father in 2020. This conversation is like many we had over the years. It is not scripted, and neither one of us prepared ahead of time. My dad passed away in January 2021. Listening to this recording warms my heart. Hearing his voice and listening to his stories brings back fond memories of our patio chats. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I'm here, JoAnne Michaels. I'm 56 years old in Bradenton, Florida, getting ready to interview my dad, who is how old?
79.
79 years young. So why don't we start out with the beginning? So where were you born?
I was born in Lenox Hill Hospital in Manhattan, New York on March 5th, 1940.
And how old was your mom?
My mother was born in 1910, so she would have been 30 years old.
Do you have any siblings?
I do, or I did. I have two siblings, two older brothers. Thomas J. Kennedy Jr., who was 8 years older than I am, and John Kennedy, who was 5 years older than me.
Okay, and how many siblings did your dad have?
He had one brother who was 2 years older than him, and my father was born in 1909.
In this country?
Yes.
Okay. And what was his brother's name?
His nickname was Lefty, but his Christian name was James.
And then how many siblings did your mom have?
My mom had Aunt Julie, who was the oldest. She had a brother, Nicholas Scollard, named after his father. And she had a sister, Teresa, who died when she was about 20 years old. So there were 4 in total, including my mother, that my grandmother had.
So what happened to Teresa?
She had a bad heart. They didn't have many cures for bad hearts in those days. So that would have been before 1920, somewhere around there. I could pull out the exact date she died.
That's okay. So what did your dad do for a living?
My father was a machinist. He worked for the Long Island Railroad, which started out as the Pennsylvania Railroad. And the Pennsylvania Railroad was a commercial railroad for freight, ran interstate, and they bought the Long Island Railroad, which was primarily a passenger railroad. They fell upon some hard times, and the Pennsylvania Railroad was encouraged to purchase them. So he worked for the railroad for 42 years. Wasn't sure he was going to like it.
Was that considered a good job back then?
In 1940, the year I was born, the largest employer in America was the National Railway System. Now it's the United States government. But they employed, as an organization, more people than any other company in America. So yes, it was considered a good job. It had benefits.
Did your dad go to college?
No.
What about your mom? Did she work?
She worked off and on. She worked for B. Altman's, as did several of her cousins. It's kind of like a family thing.
Mm-hmm.
She had various jobs there. Today they'd be called entry-level positions. Christmas time she was in the wrapping department, and other times she was whatever. Her first cousin, Mildred Burke, she was there, I guess, and she retired there. She was there more than 40 years. They had benefits. And I asked her once, I said, well, what did you do there? She says, I'm in bedding. I said, well, like you buy bedding for the whole company? She says, no, I just work in the Fifth Avenue store. I'm in bedding. So, true story. So that's what she did. And there was a, little job culture there. She had friends that worked there and whatever. But she retired from there. Ultimately, she died. She died I think, the same day as my brother Tommy. She had meningitis.
So wait a minute, you said your mom died the same day as your Uncle Tommy.
No, Mildred. They were first cousins. They all grew up basically in the same tenement.
And this was in New York City.
In New York City. As they came to America, there was no Ellis Island. And they came through the port of New York or Boston or Canada. And they settled in a place in Manhattan called Five Points. It's a Leon DiCaprio movie about that. They went there because that's where the Irish community came and settled. There was food there. There was support. A guaranteed wage, better than they received in Ireland. Now, that was when Canal Street is it's a big street in Manhattan. It used to actually be a canal. And the industry that grew up around the canal was the tanning of leather. So they would get the hides that came in from the Erie Canal into the port of New York. They would process the hides and ship them to Europe and other places. It became so disease infected that ultimately the city of New York, by this time was run by the Irish, had to shut it down. Right. So they migrated uptown to Yorkville. That would be in Manhattan in the 90s on the east side. So if you ask them where they came from, it was Yorkville. And I guess that's where they grew up as teenagers and got married from, etc. My grandmother got married from 5 Points, 6th Street. 6th Street is still there in Manhattan as a street. The canal has long since been a highway. I have my grandmother's original wedding invitation, which is interesting. But that's where they came from. And Mama was my grandmother. We called her Mama because my mother called her Mama. She had a number of sisters. She had Aunt Loretta. She had Aunt Tessie, who was the patriarch of the family. She was the oldest sister. There were 2 more sisters. They got wiped out. The family, a large part of them got the Spanish flu in 1918 when it killed 15 million people. A good part of their family got wiped out. Mm-hmm. They just lived 2 or 3 days with the flu and they died and off they went. I guess the other side of the family had probably a little bit more money. My son never much interested in gravestones and such things, although he worked in a cemetery once. We took him and he visited all the relatives who are all still there. And he was just amazed that, these stones chiseled by some guy with a chisel and a hammer are still standing and they're still in good shape and had the names and the dates and who died and who's buried there. And that's kind of like a family tree, one part of the family. So we expect that was Aunt Loretta's side of the family put that up. But they lived there and they died there.
Was Mama born in this country?
Mama was born in this country, yeah.
And then how did your parents meet?
They lived in the neighborhood, same neighborhood. Which is interesting in researching it because my grandmother on my father's side lived in a different parish. It's reputed she went to Mass every day. But she didn't go to the same church, same parish, as did the Schollards. So I always wondered why that was, whether they were better than or had more money or were more socially mobile. He was in the produce business. Her husband. Now, his name was obviously Kennedy, John Kennedy, who my brother Jackie and four of his generation, grand generation, they're all John Kennedy. And they're buried on Long Island. My grandmother, I remember when my grandmother died in 1947. She was born in 1873. So she lived a long life. She was born within, it's like a kid in 1950 being born and being told the stories of World War II. It's only 5 or 6 years difference.
So what was her greatest accomplishment?
I think she was a good religious woman. She didn't work. My grandmother and my grandfather were deaf and dumb.
So and this is Mama or your dad's?
This is my father's side of the family. And they went to school. They went to a school for the deaf and dumb in what we would now call the Bronx. So I suspect they had to have some money to be able to do that. But they met there, and ultimately they got married. I think they were in their late 30s when they got married, so I guess you had to have money to get married. But her maiden name was Tierney, and her mother's maiden name was Horan. So the Irish on that side of the family goes back pretty far. Kind of lost trace of those beginnings because there was a lot of religious strife in Ireland, and they would burn each other's churches down, and with them went the records. Yeah. So the records go back to 1837 that have been preserved. So that much we know. But I remember my grandmother on 2 occasions, because she didn't talk. But we all learned a few words they signed. My grandfather, John Kennedy, he died in 1943. So I was very small. And my grandmother died in 1947. I remember her coming to Rockaway to visit. And that was a very rare occasion.
So what did they die of? Do you remember?
Well, if you lived to be in your 70s, it was old age, whatever it was. I don't have any death certificates from their side of the family that I recall. I asked my brother Jack, because he would have been 8 years old, and they went to the cemetery in a limousine, which was big stuff. And he says he has no recollection of it. He says he did remember riding once as a kid in a fancy car. And they drove way up into the country, Manhattan to the Bronx.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Of course, they didn't have the Cross Bronx Expressway or anything like that. He says that might have been John Kennedy's funeral. And I remember when my grandmother died. Now I'm just trying to think. Yeah, she had died. And that left Uncle Lefty, James Kennedy, who was buried in the same grave as my mother and father. So that left him as a bachelor. And he had a place in Yorkville to the day he died, and was a steam fitter, was in the union and always had benefits. And he was also best friends with the union delegate who ran the New York steam fitters, if you will. So he always had whatever he needed. I remember going to his wake. I was going to RCA Institutes at the time. Well, I stopped off in the afternoon, and Jeannie Murray was the fellow's name, and I can remember there was this union guy, steam fitter, always worked with his hands, wearing an Italian cut suit, Italian shoes. I said, there's something to this union business.
So did you ever talk to him? Did he ever act as a mentor or try and guide you or lead you?
We never saw him. The only time I saw him is when he would come down with his mother, which was my grandmother. And she was a nice lady. Used to call her Mama Nuna. Nobody in the family could tell you that,
Mm-hmm.
all right? I think that's because the way she spoke. But my mother always treated her with great deference and respect. Well, she didn't for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that was always very important. And my mother warned me. She said, okay, now Mama Nuna's coming. Okay. There's a side story to this, too. And she'll probably open her purse and give you a nickel for an ice cream cone. She says, we'll make up the difference. Because they were 20 cents or whatever they were then. It's just don't say anything. I remember as a kid, I was in the high chair because I had oatmeal or cream farina. I don't know if you know what that is. And she put her finger in it and thought it was very funny, and I would scream. One day, Michael was visiting us in Manassas, and he was sitting in his high chair, and I don't know why. And he screamed, and I said, now, where did I get that from?
Mm-hmm.
Came from Mama Nuna. That's the way she got your attention. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I often think about that.
That's cute.
So that was that generation.
So tell me more about your mom.
You see the picture out there on the wall, and those are the immediate family, I guess. That could fit in the picture. But 1946, before 1946, she was diagnosed with TB. TB was a death sentence. It was the AIDS of the day. Only cure for that was bed rest. Bed rest was expensive because you were quarantined by the city of New York. And there is a hospital in Queens called Triborough Hospital. It's still there. So I have pictures of her in the hospital, and it's hard to believe she was in her early 30s. I can never fathom my mother being in her 30s. You know? I think she had a hard life. She was sick, and she had absolutely no control over her environment. All right? Which is sad. A year or so later, my father got diagnosed with TB. So now that was 2. I was a little guy. I was 4 years old. Found out later they split the family up. I went to live with Aunt Tessie. I thought it was, going to visit Aunt Tessie. Because she always had ice cream and stuff. So, but they wouldn't let me see my brothers. I won't make my pup. Could have been Michael, could have been any of the kids. Yeah. But she was dying. And the word came around, yeah, she's got maybe 6 months. This is now after World War II, so 1946, 1947. She had a surgeon. She had part of her lung removed, which meant you had to surgically remove your shoulder blade, which is a big bone, and a bunch of your ribs so the doctors could get in and cut your lung out. Both my mother and father had the same operation. So he comes to her. My father recovered, knock on wood, he recovered pretty well. He says, so, you've only got a short time. So my mother said, yeah, I figured that. Hospital wards, they talk, anyway. So he says, we've got an experimental drug. She says, well, what's the downside of that? He says, you're going to be dead in 6 months. He says, there is no downside. He says, may have some after effects. So she signed up for the program.
Okay.
And that bought her 14 more years.
Wow.
Her big desire was to see her boys get married. Missed it by a month. 1 month before I got married.
But you knew you were getting married.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
It
yeah.
wasn't a secret.
It was not a secret. She was very protective.
Yeah.
I was the only boy at home. As I remember the name of the drug, it was nitrazid. I don't know why I remember that. But that morphed into the mycin family, streptomycin. And she spent the rest of her life getting shots of streptomycin. That plus having the disability of a big part of her body being cut away, she was always in pain. And she didn't like to take drugs. She had a little box of white pills, which was codeine, hidden away, and no, I won't take them. But she always cashed the prescription. So she had pills if she needed them. So that's the way that went. And of course, my father lived 10 years later, who you may remember.
So was he in a lot of pain as well? Or not as much?
No, he went back to work. So he was well enough to go back to work. I don't know why two people with a similar operation, one would, it may be the rest of the supporting structures of the body, you know. So he worked on the railroad and had his benefits and travelers insurance, and he kind of ran the household. The splitting the family up didn't work. So instead of us living with different people, Mama came and lived with us. All right. Actually, the story is Mama came to live with us. No, we came to live with Mama. And she ran the household, and that's where the life's lessons were learned. She had a cat and nine tails, and 3 misbehaving boys, and was not shy about whacking you across the bottom with it. Whack! Now, Mama, when she was a young woman, she was ice skating and fell, and as little Julie, who just died, I asked her once what that story was. She says she cracked her spine, broke her back. So she walked with a cane every day of her life. One of us always put on her stockings because she couldn't bend over. And I can still remember that. But she did the cooking and the cleaning, and order was kept. So learned a lot, as you are well aware. Pick a subject. And we all went to public school 43, which was 4 blocks from our house. Walk was not a big deal. But I can remember Aunt Julie signing me up with public school 43. Didn't go to kindergarten. There was no kindergarten, which amazed Collie. You didn't go to kindergarten. Everybody goes to kindergarten. Well, I didn't. But I can remember her taking me by the hand, and there was this big Victorian gray stone building, you know. She registered me for school. Mrs. Burns, I can still remember, was a big fat Irish lady, was the principal.
So was this in Rockaway?
I was in Rockaway on 110th Street. We lived in 106th. I guess from our house down to 90th Street it was a mixed neighborhood of white people, primarily Irish. And then from the 90s down to the 70s, it was predominantly black people. From the bottom of the 70s, 69th Street down to the 40s was predominantly Jewish. Each immigrant family came and located with their ilk, if you will. If you went the other way to Rockaway Park, it was more, a way I would put it is those were white people that had made it a half a generation ahead of the people behind them. So they had jobs, they worked. And then after Bell Harbor was Neponset. Now we're only talking 7 miles, the whole strip. And 3 different mayors lived in Neponset, so it was an affluent area. Uncle Tommy got a job delivering drugs, bicycle with the big basket, and everybody worked. So he did that, and I guess he did some banana jobs until he got drafted, or was going to be drafted into the Navy. They both got married in 1956, Jackie and Tommy, and I was an only child, which of course I capitalized on.
A dream come true.
Not really. I remember once I told my father, I want to buy some weights and, work out, because I was always skinny. Oh, you want to work out? So he goes into the kitchen, comes out with a bucket and a mop. He says, start in the kitchen, then the bathroom. Never asked for that again.
Oh my God.
It was different. It was different than most of the neighbors. But that's the cards you were dealt. I didn't know any better. So when Nicholas Scholar died, he left Mama with 4 children. And the oldest was 10 when they were married. Mama was not an old woman. She was in her early 30s. And there was no home relief or, subsidies from the state. So she opened a candy store. Sold cigarettes and newspapers and candy and soda. And
So where did she get the money to do that?
she had sisters. They all pulled together. It was easier to get her a job than to subsidize the family, I think. But Aunt Loretta always had access to money for numerous ways you could imagine. There was one rumor that Uncle Joe was connected to one of the 5 families in New York and always had access to cash. He bought Mildred a Buick once, a new Buick, because she liked to go to Atlantic City, her and Aggie. And he didn't have a driver's license. He bought it for them. Cash. Where does that come from? Whenever we would go there or visit, there was always $20 bills given out, which in the 40s was a lot of money. And my mother would say, no, Aunt Loretta meant that for me. Well, there's an electric bill that's paid.
So did you work in the candy store?
In her candy store?
Yeah.
So this was when she was in New York City. My mother and father moved to Rockaway. I have pictures to support all of this in the various places. So Mama moved to Rockaway. It was very rural. It was a lot less harsh than New York City. So what did she do? She opened a candy store. That's the picture of standing in the window. Mm-hmm. She had hot dogs and French fries and
clam chowder.
Clam chowder, which she made herself, and Pat Hannon will tell you how she used to cut up the potatoes. We used to refer to her, oh, the princess is coming. But we all have our different insights, right? Yes. But that's where I learned how to make change. And I could have been like the first grade because, I knew about that much. So that was 1946. During the war, Rockaway was a booming town. Lots of sailors and soldiers, and streets were packed with people, and sailors would be on leave and they'd spend lots of money. And different times. Rockaway was... it was for lower middle class folks from Manhattan. That was the fresh air, the breeze, no air conditioning. When air conditioning came, World War II was over, people had more money to spend. They stopped going to Rockaway, they started to go to other places, better places. They could pick and choose because everybody had the freeze. It was called air conditioning. So that started the decline of Rockaway as a beach community, all right? And a fellow named Robert Moses, who, if you do some reading, he accelerated that process. He built the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, built Jones's Beach Amphitheater. Never held an elective office, but he had the ability to get bond houses to put up money for bonds, because you had to pay it back. And the bonds were guaranteed by the government's Title I program for urban renewal. And the problem is, it was like moving a set of dominoes. Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn was predominantly black. He moved the black people to Rockaway, and he built Bedford-Stuyvesant. They never moved back to where they came from because they didn't qualify. They rented it to richer people is what they did in New York. So that's how Rockaway evolved. And where did black people go? Down to the 80s, Hamels. You've walked through there. I used to work for Lenny Samuels at 2 drugstores. I used to be the night delivery guy. Ooh, it was not fun, but it paid well. I didn't want to hire me. You work for Safanti the butcher? Yeah, I used to do deliveries for him, whatever. Well, I don't know. I said, listen, are you related to Anne Shirley Samuels? He says, yeah, that's my daughter. How do you know her? I said, we've been in the same class for 4 years. You ask her if she would hire me, and if she says no, question solved, no problem. If she says yes, you rethink it. That night I got a phone call, you're hired. It's a little blonde Jewish girl. I don't know, we never dated her. She was in the same classroom for 4 years. So that's how I got into the delivery business. But I had all that candy store experience, and you learn how to deal with customers, you learn how to deal with unruly customers. So that was part of it. In the meantime, I was going to school. I guess school was not big in our neighborhood or in our family. And Uncle Tommy went to school. He was class president of his high school. He was smart. So that's kind of like the existence theorem. Like, well, he can do that. Why can't I do that? So I did. He went in the Navy. He enlisted in the Navy the day before the Korean War broke out. Talk about luck.
Why did he do that?
Because he was going to be drafted into the Army.
Oh, okay.
So we went to our resident guru on such things, the local doctor, Dr. Bendo, and who was a Navy vet. He's a Navy doctor. And they put their heads together and they talked the pros and the cons. He says, you're a soldier, you're up to here in mud. He says, you're on a ship, you have a warm bed, you have this, you got all that iron surrounding you, you know. So that's what he signed up for. And he put his time in, you know, the war broke out, he was furious. They changed his contract. I said, tell Harry Truman, who was the president. But he survived. There's pictures of him around in uniform. You talk about lessons you learn. He's out of school. He took business courses, so he knew how to type. I think an advertising company he worked for. He must have been the office boy or the file clerk or whatever. But they had a suggestion program. So he suggested how on every memo that was sent out, they could save a half a page of paper. And everything was done with paper and, you know, all these. The people that reviewed suggestions dismissed it out of hand. Nope, not going to do it. And he was beside, but it's, you know, it's so clear. This is just a clear savings. And he's talking to my father, little kid listening, right? So if he's 18, I was 8. He says it's not going to happen. So he was very upset, my brother. Gone. I said, well, how do you get people to listen, you know, in the business world? Oh, he says, you bring them a change they want. It doesn't have to be a good change or a bad change. It's one that they want. I said, oh, he says, if you want to succeed, you bring something to the table. Never forgot that. Any job I took, IBM, RCA, Sun Micro, I always brought something to the table. Did I want? Some of them were really stupid. It's what the boss wanted. And that's what he rewarded. So there were very subtle messages I got from my father. And we both worked on the railroad for a year together. I was an apprentice. So we rode to work back and forth every day. And he would take me to the dentist and we'd go and sit in the waiting room and talk. And I guess that's it's not what people say. It's you kids watch what they do. So from that point of view, it's a good role model. Good steady fellow, as they say. And put up with an awful lot of crap in life. You know. Went through similar experiences. I remember once sitting on the step going into the house in Chantilly. Do we hang together as a family or do we split up? Big decision. And I could hear my mother's voice. I knew how that just tore her up. She'd have no control of her children. I said, well, we'll rule that one out. Mm-hmm. And we went on. Successfully, not successfully, You guys judge. But that's where it came from. And there were more than enough cousins around. None of them ran down to volunteer. I had that discussion with Aunt Geraldine, and she was in a halfway house and there was a flood and she lost all her pictures. So I said, oh, what was that? And he was sitting on Colleen's porch. I said, Geraldine, all you had to do was pick up the phone. I said, we always had a big house. We always could have room for two in a bedroom. It was not a big deal. She looked at me, she says, I didn't think I could do that. I said, why? Because, I like Geraldine. Went to her senior prom. But she says, I shared a bedroom for many years with my sister and we never spoke. I said, that's sad. So most of the lessons I learned in life were from my brothers. So I don't know what went on in Long Beach, but there was not a lot of communications. It was interesting. Okay, we got through the gift of the Magi, the manger. What else?
My father was getting tired, and we stopped talking here. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did.